Hello there, it's a Saturday right around noon, just a little past it. We're standing outside exit 6 of Sinseol-dong Station. And right in front of us here is a 5-way intersection with 5 roads that have a terminal point here. Directly across from us right there, if you know anything about Seoul, you'll know that road. That is Jongno. It's the road that leads through the downtown area, through a lot of historical sites. The other end, the western end, terminates at Gwanghwamun Plaza, and this is the eastern terminus in front of us. Over there, leading northward, is Bomunro. The north end of that one terminates just, about 3 or 4 blocks away at Dongsomunro, at a point near Songshin Women's University Station. Right there, leading east, is Wangsanro, and that leads past Chongyangni Station and Gyeongdong Market, Gyeongdong Shijang, ultimately terminating somewhere around Haegi. We'll come back to this road in a minute, but right there, this is called Nangaero, and this leads south across Cheonggye Stream, ultimately to Gumho-dong. And our route today is taking us this way along Chonho-daero. Daero we can translate in English as boulevard. You'll notice all these other streets I named, they all have the ro suffix. This one, daero, day is always makes something bigger, grander. A school is a hakyo, but a university is a daehakyo. So it's the same concept here. But if you look at this decidedly does not look like a boulevard. It's not that big, but it does widen further on up. Now this road is the longest of the 5 that meet at this intersection, and this takes you into the southeastern part of northern Seoul on the north side of the river. Across the river is the Chonho-daegyo, the Chonho Bridge, and into Gangdong-gu, Chonho-dong. It takes you through Chonho-dong there. And I brought you out here today to answer some questions. The reason I picked this spot will become apparent at the end for the last question. But also, there's some connection to our first question. This intersection back here, Bomunro, going to the north. If we go back a couple of years to my very first favorite places video, I took you to a bakery that is on Bomunro. It's called Ishine Bangchib, I think it was called, something like that. Anyway, in English, it's Baker Lee. And there's a restaurant near there, Hanu Sonongtang. I took you to that restaurant. And not far from there is a little market that I took you to. And the first question today is related to those. Do I still visit the places I showed you in my first favorite places video? Yes, I do still visit those places. We live a lot closer to them now since we moved. It's a 15-20 minute walk to that little area from my apartment. Here we go, the Songbukcheon. The ice that was here last week, or even just a few days ago, is pretty much gone now. Yeah, the bakery I go to when I'm in the mood for a ciabatta, or they have this really good garlic butter baguette, and I get that from time to time. But yeah, I mean, the last time I went was probably maybe a month ago. So I don't go that often, but I do still go. The restaurant, it's been a couple of months since I last went there. I don't eat out very often anymore. I will either order something or cook, or my wife will cook, or sometimes when I'm on a walk, I'll pick something up, to go and take it home. Very rarely do I go to a restaurant to eat anymore. But yeah, since we moved, I've been to that Hanu Sorongtan restaurant twice. So we moved at the beginning of September. The market, I walk through there pretty regularly, and unfortunately, the little tteokgalbi place that I showed you, the place that I really, really liked, it's gone. They shut down. And that was the context of the email I got that asked this question. A lot of places in Seoul disappear. You'll find a favorite place and you'll go time and again, and then one day it's gone, and that happens. It's normal. And I should probably make a list of things that I've shown you that are no longer there, because that tteokgalbi place is not the only one. But yeah, if I show you a place in one of my favorite places videos, it is a place that I go back to again and again. So okay, I want to make sure I get this one right. I got to read it here. I've read that many Korean restaurants turn away solo diners, but I've seen you eating alone in restaurants in your videos. Do you have any advice on finding places to eat solo? The best advice I can give in that scenario is don't go to group-oriented restaurants. And, that sounds snarky, but it's not. It's true. The problem is that if you're not familiar with Korea, if you're just visiting, or if you haven't been here long, you're not going to know the difference between group-oriented restaurants and restaurants that aren't group-oriented. If you spend any time in Reddit, which is a social media site, it's more discussion-centric. One of the common complaints I see there from people who visit Korea is this: how difficult it is to eat alone. They keep getting turned away from restaurants. I can tell you, in my 35 years of living here, it will be 35 years in June 2026, I've been turned away from a restaurant exactly one time. And probably the best example, the most obvious example of this, barbecue restaurants. Barbecue in Korea, where you have the grill on the table and you're grilling the meat, that is a group-oriented restaurant. It's not for solo diners. They sell the meat at a minimum for 2 people. That's just the way the culture has evolved around those barbecue restaurants. And there are other restaurants like that where they serve dishes like in a big hot pot style or something like that. Those are oriented toward groups. Here we are next to the Jungneungcheon now. Over across the Jungneungcheon, and here it's still frozen over. Look at that. But yeah, there's this myth that's developed online now that many Korean restaurants don't allow solo diners, and that's just not the case. Most Korean restaurants allow solo diners. Even some barbecue restaurants will allow solo diners. You can go in and order kimchi jjigae, for example. Not all of them, but some of them will let you do that. In one of my early videos, I walked into Seoul Shiktang, which is a group-oriented restaurant. They sell yumtam bulgogi, which is thinly sliced pork. Usually when you hear bulgogi, you think beef, but this is pork. It doesn't have to be beef, it's just thinly sliced. But I go there by myself all the time to have their kimchi jjigae. The one time in my 35 years that I was turned away from a restaurant, it was a barbecue restaurant. Back in the day, back in the 90s, I used to sometimes go to a barbecue restaurant and order 2 or 3 orders worth of meat for myself. They would let me go in and do it in the off hours, not during the peak, dinner hour or whatever. Yeah, some restaurants will let you do that if you just ask. Some will not. They will turn you away. It's not that Korean restaurants don't like solo diners. It's just that some restaurants are group oriented and some are not. And so what you have to do is learn the difference between them. And it doesn't take long to do that, but if you're here just visiting, you know, you're a tourist, you're probably not going to be here long enough if you're here just a week or so to get that. So I'll probably do a video one day in the near future. I've been thinking about it on this topic because it does come up quite a bit online. And, you know, there's no way I'm going to sit here and tell you all the different kinds of restaurants that you can eat at solo just walking down the street here. You look here across the street, this Home Plus is empty now. The Home Plus is gone, which is wild because this building here was kind of a landmark. As a long-term expat in Korea, you've observed the country's development with a certain distance that locals may not have. In retrospect, prior to Korea's global cultural ascent, did you feel it was bound to happen? Or would you attribute it more, where did it go? To timing and serendipity? Okay, I'll answer that question in just a second, but I want to show you this. Think about the street here and this environment, and then look at what's ahead of us up here. It's almost like two different worlds. So these are some older residences, I would guess 1980s, still standing, surrounded by all this modernity. Of course, these were the peak of modernity in Korea when they were built. To the question, one of the things about being here in the 90s, it kind of felt like being part of a special club. There weren't a lot of people outside of Korea who knew very much about it. Being here then as an American, seeing all of the early days of K-pop, which, you know, nobody thought of it as K-pop back then. It was just Korean music, Korean pop music, Korean dance music, whatever. In the mid-90s, there was a group called Ruda that came onto the scene. They were pretty popular with their first album, but their second album took them to the moon, right? They skyrocketed. They were huge here, one of the biggest groups at the time. But outside of Korea, who knew about them? So at the time, did I think it was inevitable that that kind of thing would spread beyond Korea? No, I didn't. There was nothing about Korean culture that I thought would take over the world. It was just so different from anything, and I just couldn't imagine most people in North America or Europe or Oceania or wherever, you know, I couldn't imagine most of them appreciating it or getting into it. And so that was not something I expected. But I remember in the early 2000s when Boa broke through in Japan. She was the first Korean artist to really break through in Japan. And then she was followed by Winter Sonata, the drama. It became a huge hit in Japan. It sparked all kinds of tourism to Korea. But I learned recently that Korean culture was already breaking through into China. Before that, in the late 90s, there were K-dramas that were taking off in China in 1997. HOT had a concert in China in 99 or 2000, something like that. Dramas were taking off throughout Asia. They were spreading, and it spread in Asia first. And there were attempts to get to the rest of the world. It wasn't until just a few years later that K-pop acts started breaking through. But also you had the Korean government pushing Korean food. They had a marketing campaign. I don't remember the years when this was going on, but they were marketing Korean food in New York. So I think in some ways, you know, it was, of course, intentional. You had companies and you had the government pushing Korean culture. abroad, I have no idea what the magic formula was that actually made it happen. And I keep focusing on K-pop, but it's not just that, of course. K-movies became a thing. I have a friend in Iceland who's, really into Korean movies. And I was really, really surprised in, 2019, my wife and I were in Canterbury in the UK, and we walked into a Boots pharmacy, and there is a whole section of shelves full of K-beauty products. I had no idea K-beauty was a thing overseas. But there it was in Canterbury, UK, right? So it's been interesting and fascinating watching the world become so fascinated in and interested with Korean culture. I'm no longer part of a special club. I'm part of a global community now. So I think that's actually really cool. I've been thinking about it. I have no idea what it is that really made Korean culture take off. I just think it's very cool that it did. I've been in Korea for 2 years and I love it, but I'm very interested in what it was like in the 90s when my father was here as a soldier. Would it really have been such a different experience for him than it is for me? I talk a lot in my videos about how much Korea has changed in the time that I've been here. And I'm glad I got this question because it prompted me to think about that in a way I hadn't thought about it before. Being here, as things have changed around me, it hasn't always been noticeable, right? It's only in hindsight that things look different. And that's just the nature of our lived experience, right? We go through life and there are little changes here, little changes there. Most changes are not big and grand. Most of the changes are not immediately noticeable. It's only after they've accumulated over time that you look back and say, that's different. So in many ways, living in Korea for me right now isn't all that different from living in Korea in the 90s. Yeah, there are many broad differences around me in my day-to-day life. It's still the same. But this question, would it have been different for his father in the 90s than it is for him today? From that perspective, unequivocally, the answer is yes, absolutely. In 1991, when I first got here, the president was Roh Tae-woo. He was the first democratically elected president in decades. Korea had just come off of 4 decades of authoritarian rule. Roh Tae-woo was elected in December of 1987. After the regime of Chun Doo-hwan was finally brought down by protests, right? He finally conceded and allowed the elections to proceed, and Roh Tae-woo won. The problem, though, is at that time in 1991, nobody knew for sure if this was going to stick because Roh Tae-woo was Chun Doo-hwan's right-hand man. And both of them had been in the military under Park Chung-hee. When Park Chung-hee was assassinated in 1979, Chun Doo-hwan was able to come to power because he was the one in charge of investigating the assassination and apprehending the culprit. And he used that opportunity to stage a coup and take control. And Park Chung-hee had come to power after a military coup in 1961. And before that, the first president of Korea, Lee Syngman-rhee, came to power in 1948, virulently, zealously anti-communist, and believed the ends justified the means. he undertook some really horrible acts that I'm not going to go into here. I might do that in another video one day. By the way, this is the Jungnangcheon. We saw the north end of this in my walk from Uijeongbu to Dongducheon. Much narrower on the north end near its source. Right now we are very close to the Han River. It empties out into the Han River just right over there. Yeah, so, you know, Lee Seung-man ultimately changes the Constitution to allow himself to stay in power. From 1948 to 1960, he's the guy in charge until he's finally brought down through protests, through the April 19th revolution. So yeah, from 1948 to 1987, 4 decades of authoritarian rule. 35 years of authoritarian rule under the Japanese colonial administration. From 1910 to 1945, at the end of World War II. Then you had that little 3-year interim of US military government. And before that, the peninsula was dominated for a couple thousand years by dynastic rule. Different dynasties, the names changed, the rules changed, the ideologies changed, but fundamentally it was all the same. So in 1991, when I first got here, that is the first time that Korea has ever really been under the administration of a democratically elected president. There were some concerns about whether the election had really been free and fair because of Roh Tae-woo's ties to Chun-doo-hwan. There was concern about whether the next election would be free and fair, whether things would really progress, whether democracy would really take hold. There was that perspective. And then there's this whole issue of the rapid economic development that had happened from the 1960s into the early 90s. Culturally and socially, things just did not keep up. Some of the issues that Korea is dealing with today are said to be consequences of that. And then there was also a whole lot of political change going on. There was still a good bit of corruption in the 90s, not just at the top politically, but also, you know, throughout society in different ways. Korea was still trying to find its footing in this post-authoritarian world that they were entering into. It wasn't that long before I got here that there were still restrictions on travel. People weren't able to freely travel. So one of the big consequences of those restrictions being lifted was that, you know, in the early 90s, a lot of people were going out to see the world. People were young people were backpacking across Europe. You had families sending their children to study overseas. Wealthy people had been doing that already. Wealthy people had certain privileges before. But now, you know, people in the middle class who could afford it were doing it. It was those people going abroad to study, learning how to cook different kinds of food, Italian food and whatnot, all the different baking styles. They are the ones who transformed Korea's food scene in the 2000s and 2010s. So anybody coming to Korea today from the West, you know, if you're coming from North America, Europe, Oceania, you're coming to a country that's not so different from your own. But anybody coming to Korea back then, in the early 90s, was coming to a country with a lot more differences than their own. So as an American, especially, coming to Korea in the 90s, it was a very different world. But I think today, it's much more similar. It's much easier to fit in. And I can tell you that I knew people, even in the early 2000s, you know, I had this coworker She was from rural Canada, and she was just miserable. She was just absolutely miserable. She hated it here. I don't know what brought her here, why she thought it would be a good idea. I never got to know her very well. She kind of stayed to herself, but she absolutely hated it here. She did not complete her contract. She left. She said something like a family member, a grandmother had died or something, and she had to get back to Canada, so she went. She never came back. I knew many people like that. It was a lot more difficult to adjust to for some people back then than it is today. I met these guys in 1996, these three guys. They had been in Korea for 17 years at that point. Close friends. They were all in the Air Force together in 1979. They all came here in 1979. There is probably a bigger difference between 1979 and 1991 for somebody coming here the first time than there is between 1991 and 2026. I believe that to be true. However, yeah, it still would have been different between 1991 and now. This last question is from somebody who was looking for some tips about walking in Seoul. He had seen my videos where I talked about how I like walking Gangnam's back streets and how I like walking downtown. So his question was, what are your favorite areas / routes to walk outside of Gangnam and downtown? There's only one answer I can give to this question, and that is areas that I'm not so familiar with. You know, I know downtown like the back of my hand, these days especially, but there was a time when there was this area around, you know, Uljiro Samga and Jongno Saga, Jongno Oga, these areas, I wasn't so familiar with them. But when I first started doing these daily walks, when we were living over by Gunja Station, I would walk from there downtown and just go all over Uljiro and all over Jongno. And now they're just as familiar to me as the rest of the downtown area. And I spent years and years walking through Gangnam. You know, not taking daily walks, but walking between gigs to kill time. So I've walked so many of the streets in Gangnam. Hanamdong, Itaewon, I know them inside out, right? Because I lived around those neighborhoods for so long. So when I go through those areas, I'm walking through the familiar, I'm walking through my past, I'm walking through my memories, I'm noticing what's changed. There's no sense of exploration or, I don't know, adventure, right? But when I go out beyond those areas to any neighborhood that I'm not familiar with, it doesn't matter where it is, you know, any part of the city, now I feel like an explorer again, because everything around me is unfamiliar. Everything around me is new. And the reason I chose Cheonho-daero today for this walk as I'm answering these questions is because sections of it are familiar to me, like this right here around Gunja Station. I have been to this intersection several times over the past few years, especially when I've gone hiking at Achasan, which is just over this way on the other side of the buildings. If we keep going down the street here, we would be at Gunja Station. So I've been through here many times. But between here and Sinseol-dong Station, where we started, much of that is unfamiliar to me. The area around the Home Plus building, I know that. And a little stretch of it there near Cheonggye Stream, I know that. I've been through there a few times. But the whole continuous length of it, you know, I never had walked it until very recently. And only then did it strike me just how different each block of Cheonho-daero is. When I look at this area around Gunja Station, that is very different from the area around the Home Plus building, the area around Cheonggye Stream, the area around Sinseol-dong Station. Different buildings, different terrain, different scenery, different atmosphere. And you go through all of that. And even though I had seen some of the individual sections of it, I had never just made that connection in my mind before until I walked the whole route continuously. And so that's another aspect of exploration, right? It's only by exploring a city on foot that you can connect the dots in your mental map and make a continuous line out of them, a continuous picture. You know, you can take far-flung places and bring them closer together when you walk between them, because in your head, you know, they're so far apart, but then on the ground you realize they're really not. So yeah, that is absolutely my favorite place to walk in Seoul, any place that I'm not so familiar with. Well, thanks for coming along with me on the walk today. I hope you found something interesting in these questions and answers. This is the 5th Q&A session I've done. If you want to see more, I've got a playlist right over there. Just click on that, and I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.